I don't know, Grandma. That's not really my problem. Mom says you should have thought about that before you started telling embarrassing stories about Dad being poor or whatever. The line went dead. Rose stood in the country club parking lot, watching wealthy families drive away in luxury vehicles, feeling more alone and humiliated than she had ever felt in her life. The valet, a kind young man who had witnessed the entire scene, offered to call her a taxi, but Rose realized with growing panic that she truly didn't have enough cash for the fare home. That's when the ultimate cruelty occurred. Her phone rang, and it was David. Mom, Crystal's really upset about tonight. You made us look bad in front of important people with your dramatics. We're going to drop you at that gas station off Highway 9, where you can call someone else to pick you up. We can't deal with this anymore. David, please. I don't have anyone else to call, and I didn't do anything wrong. Mom, we'll be there in 5 minutes. Be ready. The line went dead, and Rose felt her world collapse completely. Standing in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the Texaco station, Rose Marie felt something fundamental shift inside her soul. The hurt was so profound it felt physical. A crushing weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. But as the shock began to wear off, it was replaced by something else entirely. A cold, clear anger that cut through 45 years of maternal excuses and unconditional forgiveness. For the first time in decades, Rose allowed herself to see her family's behavior without the rose-colored glasses of maternal love. She thought about Crystal's casual cruelty in rewriting the history of David's education, erasing Rose's sacrifices as if they had never happened. She remembered Madison's phone call, the teenager's callous dismissal of her grandmother's predicament, as if Rose's welfare was genuinely not her problem. Most painfully, she replayed David's cold, calculated decision to abandon his mother at a gas station because her presence had become an inconvenience. Sitting on a concrete bench outside the convenience store, Rose pulled out her phone and scrolled through years of text messages. Her invitations to family dinners met with excuses. Her offers to babysit declined in favor of expensive nannies. Her birthday and holiday calls answered with distracted, hurried responses. The pattern had been there all along, but her desperate need to maintain family connections had blinded her to the reality that those connections had become one-sided years ago. Rose thought about her late husband Tom, who had always told her that respect was earned through actions, not demanded through blood relations. She remembered her own mother, who had taught her that dignity was something no one could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. For too long, Rose realized, she had been surrendering her dignity piece by piece, accepting disrespect and ingratitude because she was terrified of being completely alone. But sitting in that gas station, abandoned and humiliated, Rose understood that she was already alone. The family she thought she was fighting to preserve existed only in her imagination. The real David, Crystal, Madison, and Mackenzie were strangers who happened to share her DNA, but not her values of loyalty, gratitude, or basic human decency. The turning point came when Rose remembered a conversation she had had with her attorney, Margaret Foster, 6 months earlier. Margaret had been urging Rose to update her will and estate planning documents, warning her that her current arrangements left her vulnerable and didn't reflect her true wishes. At the time, Rose had dismissed the suggestion, insisting that family was family and that David would always take care of her. Now Rose understood how naively she had been thinking. David wasn't taking care of her. He was managing her like an unwanted obligation, keeping her at arm's length, while presumably counting on her eventual inheritance to supplement his already comfortable lifestyle. The house she had nearly lost to pay for his education, the life insurance policy she maintained despite financial strain, the modest savings account she had built through decades of frugal living, all of it was probably factored into David's financial planning as his eventual windfall. Rose pulled out her phone and made 3 calls that would change everything. First, she called her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who drove 30 miles to pick her up from the gas station, listening with growing outrage as Rose explained what had happened. Second, she called Margaret Foster's emergency line and left a message, requesting an urgent appointment first thing Monday morning. Third, she called her bank's customer service line and requested a complete review of all her accounts, beneficiaries, and automatic payments. As Mrs. Patterson drove her home through the dark countryside, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of control over her own destiny. The fear and hurt were still there, but they were now accompanied by a steely determination that reminded her of the strong woman she had been before she allowed her family to diminish her into a convenient scapegoat for their own guilt and inadequacy. The scared, abandoned woman who had stood in that gas station was gone. In her place was someone who had finally learned the difference between loving unconditionally and enabling unconscionable behavior. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable clarity, both in the weather and in Rosemarie's resolve. Her first stop was the law office of Margaret Foster, where she spent 4 hours completely restructuring her estate planning in ways that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The house that David had always assumed would be his inheritance, the same house Rose had mortgaged twice to fund his education, would now be donated to the Nurses' Educational Foundation upon her death, funding scholarships for single mothers pursuing nursing degrees. Rose's life insurance policy, which had been designated to benefit David since his father's death, was redirected to establish a memorial fund in Tom's name for families dealing with cancer-related financial hardships. Her savings account, carefully accumulated through decades of working overtime and living frugally, would be split between the local animal shelter and St. Jude Children's Hospital, organizations that had never made her feel ashamed of her generosity. "Rose, are you absolutely certain about these changes?" Margaret Foster asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. These are significant alterations to make in the immediate aftermath of an emotional incident. Rose's response was calm and unwavering. "Margaret, this isn't emotional. This is practical. I've spent 45 years investing in people who have shown me exactly how little they value that investment. It's time I started investing in people who will actually appreciate it." But Rose wasn't finished with her reclamation of power. She also discovered that David had been listed as her emergency contact at the hospital, where she'd worked for over 4 decades, giving him access to her medical information and decision-making authority if she became incapacitated. That was changed immediately, with Margaret Foster designated as her healthcare proxy and Mrs. Patterson as her emergency contact. Most significantly, Rose made a decision that would hit David where it would hurt most: his professional reputation. She decided to establish the Thomas Callahan Memorial Fund for healthcare workers, using funds from her retirement accounts to create a scholarship specifically for the children of healthcare workers who had lost parents in the line of duty. The announcement would be made at the hospital's annual charity gala, where David's colleagues would learn about Rose's generosity and, by implication, David's absence from his mother's philanthropic endeavors. When Rose called David to the sacrifices were endless and invisible. Rose ate generic cereal for breakfast, so David could have name-brand everything. She drove a 15-year-old Honda while paying for David's car insurance on the newer vehicle she'd bought him for his 16th birthday. When David expressed interest in pre-med courses, Rose took out a second mortgage on their modest home to pay for his undergraduate education at an expensive private university. During David's medical school years, Rose worked every holiday, every weekend, every double shift available, sending him monthly checks for living expenses while she survived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. She attended his graduation ceremony in a dress she'd bought at a thrift store, tears of pride streaming down her face as she watched him receive his diploma. A diploma she had literally paid for with her blood, sweat, and financial sacrifice. When David married Crystal in an elaborate ceremony that cost more than Rose's annual salary, she smiled graciously, despite Crystal's obvious disapproval of the cheap gift Rose could afford. Rose had hoped marriage would mature her son, but instead, Crystal's influence seemed to make him more distant and materialistic. Family dinners became infrequent, then rare, then virtually non-existent unless Rose initiated them. The grandchildren's arrival should have brought joy, but instead brought more evidence of changing family dynamics. Rose would arrive for visits with carefully chosen gifts, often handmade items that took hours to create, only to watch Madison and Mackenzie receive them with polite disinterest before immediately asking their parents for expensive electronics or designer items. Crystal would make subtle comments about Rose's outdated ideas about child rearing, dismissing her decades of experience as a pediatric nurse. When the twins became teenagers, Rose's irrelevance became even more pronounced. She would call to invite them for grandmother-granddaughter outings, offering to take them shopping or to museums, only to be told they were too busy with social activities or not interested in spending time with elderly relatives. David, who once called his mother every day, now communicated primarily through brief text messages, or had Crystal make obligatory holiday calls on his behalf. The shift had been gradual but relentless. Rose's wisdom was dismissed as outdated thinking. Her offers to help were declined as unnecessary interference. Her presence at family gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed, with conversations stopping when she entered rooms and resuming after she left. The woman who had been the center of David's universe for decades had become a peripheral figure in his affluent new life, kept at arm's length, like an embarrassing reminder of his humble origins. The retirement party for Dr. Harrison Mitchell, David's mentor and colleague, was being held at the prestigious Grandview Country Club, the kind of place Rose had driven past for years, but never imagined entering. When David reluctantly invited her to attend as his guest, Rose had been thrilled at the rare opportunity to be included in her son's professional world. She spent her limited discretionary income on a new dress, a simple but elegant navy blue outfit from a department store sale, and had her hair professionally styled for the first time in months. The trouble began the moment they arrived at the country club. Crystal emerged from the Mercedes wearing a designer cocktail dress that probably cost more than Rose's monthly pension. Her perfectly manicured nails glinting as she checked her appearance in her phone's camera. The twins, Madison and Mackenzie, looked like fashion models in their expensive outfits, already taking selfies and complaining about being dragged to an old people's party. "Mom, I need you to understand something," David said as they walked toward the entrance, his voice carrying the patronizing tone Rose had grown to dread. "This is a professional event with important people. Please don't embarrass us with stories about your hospital days or my childhood. These people don't need to hear about our humble beginnings." Rose felt the first stab of hurt, but smiled and nodded, determined to make the evening pleasant for everyone. Inside the opulent club, She tried to make conversation with other guests, sharing pride in David's accomplishments and asking polite questions about their families. But every time she spoke, she noticed Crystal's eye rolls and David's uncomfortable glances, as if her very presence was a source of shame. The evening deteriorated when Rose was introduced to Dr. Patricia Westbrook, the chief of cardiology at the region's most prestigious hospital. "You must be so proud of David," Dr. Westbrook said warmly. "He's told me so much about the sacrifices you made to put him through medical school. Not many mothers would work double shifts for years to support their children's dreams." Before Rose could respond, Crystal appeared at David's side with a brittle laugh. "Oh, that's just how Rose tells the story. David earned scholarships and student loans for most of his education. She likes to make it sound more dramatic than it was." The lie hit Rose like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to correct the record, to explain that she had documentation of every tuition payment, every loan she had co-signed, every sacrifice that had been erased from the family narrative. But David's warning look silenced her, and she stood there speechless as Crystal continued to minimize her contributions to polite nods from the gathered crowd. "David's always been self-sufficient," Crystal continued, her arm possessively around her husband's waist. "Independent and driven. He didn't need anyone to rescue him or make him their whole life project." The humiliation was unbearable, but worse was coming. When Rose excused herself to use the restroom, she overheard Madison talking to a friend on her phone. "Yeah, we're stuck here with Grandma Rose. Mom says we have to bring her to these things occasionally for appearances. But honestly, she's so embarrassing. She dresses like she shops at Goodwill and always wants to talk about the good old days. We're counting the minutes until we can dump her somewhere and get on with our real plans." When Rose returned to the main reception area, her family was nowhere to be found. A waiter informed her that they had stepped outside for some air, but when she went to look for them, she discovered they had left the building entirely. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she watched in horror as David's Mercedes pulled out of the parking lot. Rose ran outside, her new shoes pinching her feet as she tried to catch up with the vehicle, but they were already on the main road. She called David's cell phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. She called Crystal's phone with the same result. Finally, she called Madison's phone, and the teenager answered with obvious annoyance. "Grandma, we had to leave. Mom has a migraine, and the twins have a curfew. Dad said to tell you to call a taxi." "But Madison, I don't have money for a taxi from here to my house. That's $40 I don't have. How am I supposed to get home?" The fluorescent lights of the Texaco station buzzed overhead as 71-year-old Rose Marie Callahan stood frozen in disbelief, watching her son's black Mercedes disappear down Interstate 75 without her. Her arthritic hands trembled as she clutched her worn brown purse, the same purse she'd carried for 15 years because she'd spent her money on her family instead of herself. At 5 feet 2 inches, with silver-streaked auburn hair, always pulled back in a neat bun, Rose had the gentle demeanor of someone who had spent her life caring for others. But her steel-grey eyes now held a devastation so profound it seemed to echo in the empty parking space where her son's car had been moments before. Rose Marie had been a registered nurse for 43 years, working double shifts at Mercy General Hospital to single-handedly raise her son David after her husband died of cancer when the boy was only 10. She had sacrificed everything: her social life, her dreams of travel, even her health, to ensure David never felt the absence of his father's love or financial security. Her small hands, now marked with liver spots and swollen joints from decades of lifting patients and working overtime, had signed over her entire inheritance from her parents to pay for David's medical school tuition. She was a woman of unwavering faith and endless patience. The kind of mother who kept every report card, attended every graduation, and never missed a birthday, despite working night shifts that left her exhausted. Rose had raised David with old-fashioned values of respect, gratitude, and family loyalty, values that seemed to have vanished the moment he married Crystal, a 32-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative with champagne tastes and a cold heart. David, now 45 and a successful cardiologist, lived in a mansion with his wife Crystal and their twin daughters, Madison and Mackenzie, age 16. The girls, spoiled by their father's generous income and their mother's materialistic values, treated their grandmother like an embarrassing relic from a bygone era. Crystal, with her bleached blonde hair and designer clothes, had never hidden her disdain for Rose's modest lifestyle and what she called her martyrdom complex. What was supposed to be a simple trip to David's colleague's retirement party had turned into Rose's worst nightmare. She had spent the afternoon being ignored, dismissed, and ultimately abandoned, like an unwanted piece of luggage. The triggering incident wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated abandonment that revealed the true depths of her family's selfishness and ingratitude. Standing in that gas station parking lot, surrounded by strangers and the smell of gasoline fumes, Rose felt something die inside her chest. It wasn't just her heart breaking. It was the shattering of every illusion she'd held about the family she'd devoted her entire life to. The woman who had given everything now had nothing but the devastating realization that her unconditional love had been met with conditional tolerance that had finally run out. As the reality of her abandonment sank in, one question burned in Rose's mind with the intensity of a fever. If this was how little her family valued her after a lifetime of sacrifice, what did she really owe them in return? Rosemarie's relationship with her family had been built on a foundation of unconditional giving that began the moment she became a widow at 36. When her husband Tom died, after a 2-year battle with lung cancer, Rose was left with crushing medical debt, a mortgage, and a traumatized 10-year-old son who cried himself to sleep every night. Instead of remarrying or moving closer to her own siblings for support, Rose chose to pour every ounce of her energy into being both mother and father to David. She worked the night shift at the hospital so she could be home when David got off school, helping with homework, driving him to baseball practice, and attending every parent-teacher conference. When other nurses complained about overtime, Rose volunteered for extra shifts, banking the money for David's future education. She wore the same 3 work uniforms for years, patched and repatched, while making sure David had new clothes for each school year and spending money for activities with friends.